Well, it came to my attention over a particularly savage killing of a young woman here in Britain. And the acknowledgement by the Association of Chief Police Officers that this was not an isolated incident, that they estimated that on average there were 12 such killings a year in the United Kingdom, of which they were aware. And of course that's just the tip of the iceberg, because some of those killings are disguised as suicides, some women just disappear, taken out of the country. We don't know the scale of the problem. Then I talked to colleagues in the Council of Europe. In Turkey there's a particular problem among the Kurdish communities. The number of honour killings has doubled in Istanbul in the year before last. So it's not a reducing problem, it's one either that's increasing or one that we're becoming more aware of. Well, I don't have any evidence to suggest that there is an actual increase, and I think it may be like child abuse and domestic violence, that because there's a greater awareness, more cases are coming to the fore, more people are coming forward. I think the real issue is one to empower women not to accept the kind of patriarchal societies in which they live. Honour killing is one of the extremes of in terms of patriarchy, but it takes very many forms, and there are many societies where it's not just women's bodies, but their thoughts, their freedom of association, everything they do is controlled by men, and they have no freedom. I think the United Nations has estimated there are somewhere in the region of 5,000 killings per year worldwide, and I think we must take that as an underestimate as well. So it manifests itself in Europe largely in minority ethnic communities whose isolation may be reinforced by being in Europe, but who are bringing practices from their traditional communities and societies, which we feel are unacceptable. And I think there's a very real problem that people like myself often get accused of cultural imperialism or racism for trying to impose Western standards on different communities. I think that we have a duty to speak out on issues of human rights. Human rights are universal, they're not negotiable, and abuse of women is just one aspect of fundamental abuse of human rights. Well, accusations come generally, and I think if you try to tackle some of the communities here in the UK on female genital mutilation, for example, then you are accused of interfering in family and community matters, that you're trying to impose a different set of values on people. And my view is that women have rights, and where those rights are taken away, denied, or where they're abused, then there's a responsibility for politicians and community leaders to speak up. I think there's also a problem in some areas where people retreat into religion and say you cannot interfere with our beliefs. I don't think there's anything, and I'm not a religious scholar, but I've talked to many religious scholars. I'm not sure there is anything in any of the world's major faiths, be it Hinduism, Sikhism, Islam, Judaism, which can justify in religious doctrine the abuse of women in this way. And therefore I think it's important that we also work and engage with religious leaders, scholars, community leaders to speak out against these barbaric practices. There are a number of Asian women who are actively involved in women's organisations here, working with minority ethnic communities. We took evidence from some of them. And there are some very brave people like Dr. Abedin, a Bangladeshi doctor here in London. And I think hers is a very good example, because one often takes the view that forced marriages and all of these repressions occur in ill-educated rural communities. Dr. Abedin is a doctor practicing here in London, 35 years old, not a young, ignorant peasant from some back remote village. and yet she was effectively kidnapped and taken back to Bangladesh and forced into a marriage against her will. She managed to escape. Fortunately, she had some backing, because in the UK we've now set up a forced marriages unit within the Home Office. We have cooperation with the governments of countries where forced marriages tend to take place. And with that sort of cooperation and with the powers that are in the Forced Marriages Act that we have, she managed to secure her release and is now back in London, practicing, and very bravely is actually speaking out about her experience. I think there's also a very real problem that in the UK it is often difficult to talk about the differences between arranged marriages and forced marriages, and arranged marriages which are entered into freely by the man and woman concerned. I don't think anybody can object to those. They are cultural practices which are acceptable, provided there is full consent to that process. What we have in forced marriages is complete reversal. And we need to, I think, acquaint teachers and social workers. I mean, I think often teachers are afraid to raise the issues in classrooms for fear of accusations of cultural imperialism or racism. So we need to train, educate, empower teachers to empower their pupils. We know towards the end of term, sometimes young women from particular communities disappear from school. Now, in some communities, because they're taken off to their parents' or grandparents' home country for female circumcision. In other communities, they're taken off and forced into marriage or betrothals. So I think we need to create a greater awareness. The other problem is, I think, in Europe, is that in some countries where an act of violence is committed in the name of honour, in the name of preserving the good name of the community or the family, some judges take that as a mitigating factor. And what we've said in our report very clearly is it's not a mitigating factor. You can't excuse an act of violence against a woman on the grounds that you're doing it to protect the family honour. That should be an aggravating factor in our view, and I think we need to train the judges and the judiciary and the police, as well as teachers, social workers and all of those involved. Well, I think there is a general reticence of, because we live in a very tolerant and liberal society, where we respect different communities, traditions, cultures and practices. And because we live in that sort of tolerant society, there is a fear that if you speak out against certain practices, you're being intolerant. And I have a very firm line that where you're talking about human rights, these are not negotiable, they're not divisible, and you have to speak out. And we need to encourage more people to do so. Well, one of the other things of concern is, and where honour crimes are different from other forms of gender-based violence. In most gender-based violence, it's one person on one person, usually a man against a woman, and we're talking predominantly about violence against women. But in honour crimes, you're talking about a conspiracy which involves fathers, mothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, and it's premeditated and it's planned, and often they will get the youngest male son to carry out the actual killing or take the blame for the actual killing, in the belief that the sentence will be reduced than if it's the older brother or whoever. So these are very clear premeditated actions which are unacceptable. In Europe there appears to be a particular issue in certain Turkish communities, Kurdish communities, where there appears to be a higher prevalence than others. Here in the UK, there will be different practices in different communities. Forced marriages and honour crimes appear to be more prevalent in Bangladeshi and Pakistani communities here. Female genital mutilation is more prevalent in West African communities here. So different communities have different ways in exercising their patriarchy in that sense. But when we say that, I mean, I got criticised at one conference I was at because I said in the UK the majority of these crimes appear to occur in amongst Muslim communities. And I was immediately attacked for and criticised for denigrating Islam. And I was trying to make it clear that, you know, there was nothing I could see in Islam. And people were saying, well, then why mention it? It is a very difficult and thorny issue. The crimes that have occurred in the UK that we know of and are recorded as honour crimes have occurred in Islamic communities, in Hindu communities, in Sikh communities. So, I mean, there's no monopoly on this, but most of them occurred in South Asian communities that originated in South Asia. In other parts of Europe, it's families who originate from North Africa or from Turkey. But it's widespread, and it's the worrying factor is that some people said, well, this is past traditions that people are bringing with them to Western Europe from their communities, and this is a first and second generational thing. The evidence seems to suggest that it's not just a first and second generational thing, and those kind of structures are continuing, and they're continuing among people born, brought up, and educated in the United Kingdom. Well, I think there's an instinctive reaction in many Islamic communities that they feel they're under threat because of the prevalence of Islamophobia that exists in the Western world, and you can't blame them for that. You know, all of the images in the British press of Islam are negative images. All of the images of the Arab world in the British press are negative images. And if I was an Arab or if I was a Muslim, I would feel as angry as many of them do about the portrayal of their religion and their culture. So one does have to be wary, but where there are practices which, as I say, breach human rights, then I think we have to have the courage to speak out. And as I say, I don't think there's anything in any of the major world faiths, Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, Judaism, or Christianity, which can justify the abuse of women and denial of fundamental basic human rights. I think it's important for people in positions of power, authority or standing to speak out, but it's equally important to ensure that people within the communities themselves are empowered to speak out. I was involved many years ago in a campaign in the UK, which was the anti-dowry campaign. And that began within Sikh and Hindu communities. It was a challenge to traditions from within the community. And I think that's what's required now. I mean, I can remember in the 70s I was criticised. I used to work in race relations when I was assisting and advising victims of domestic violence, when we were talking about the need for refugees, why the Women's Aid refugees which had been set up were in many ways not geared or suited to different communities, and just talking about the issue was challenging family values and communities and interference in that, you know, bad women should be punished, and, you know, you shouldn't encourage the breakup of families. You know, I hope we've moved on since then.